8 times. 8 different frontier bride platforms. 8 times Delilah Mercer stood in a line of women and watched every single one of them get chosen, while she was left behind like something the wagon forgot to carry. She was 32 years old, heavier than the other women, older than most, and the men who passed her by didn't even bother to hide why. Now she's standing in Blackstone Ridge, her last stop, her last chance, and the selection is almost over. Every bride has been claimed, except her, again. But then a man walks through that door, and nothing goes the way anyone expected. Like this video, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Bang. The stagecoach that carried Delilah Mercer into Blackstone Ridge smelled like wet leather and other people's hope. She had been sitting wedged against the far corner of the bench for 6 hours, her carpetbag pressed against her knees, her coat pulling tight across her shoulders in the way it always did when she'd been sitting too long. Across from her 2 younger women, Charlotte, 19, with copper hair pinned in careful ringlets, and a girl named May, who never gave her last name, had spent the better part of the journey whispering to each other and periodically glancing at Delilah with expressions they thought they were hiding. They weren't hiding them. Delilah had learned to read those looks early in life. The small, downward flicker of the eyes, the tight smile that appeared when conversation was unavoidable. She had become fluent in the language of polite pity a long time ago, and she no longer wasted energy being hurt by it. She pressed her forehead against the dusty window glass and watched Blackstone Ridge come into view. It was not a beautiful town. The main street was a brown wound cutting through flat, semi-arid land, the buildings on either side standing at slightly irregular angles, as if they'd been constructed in a hurry and never corrected. A livery stable, a general store, a 2-story structure with a painted sign she couldn't read yet, a church with one broken shutter hanging off its window frame. Farther out, past the last building, the land opened up into rolling grassland that ran until it hit the distant line of ridgeline mountains, blue and cold on the horizon. It was the 8th town Delilah had come to through a frontier bride platform. She had not expected beauty from any of them. She had stopped expecting beauty from most things around year 25, when she'd realized that the world gave beauty back to the beautiful in a way it simply didn't for everyone else. That wasn't bitterness. It was just accuracy. She was a practical woman, and practical women didn't waste time arguing with arithmetic. The coach lurched to a stop, and the driver's voice came from above. "Blackstone Ridge, end of line." The Frontier Bride Cooperative operated differently in different territories, but the basic structure was always the same. Participating women registered with a regional coordinator, paid a filing fee, traveled to the designated location, and then stood in a morning selection where local men, ranchers, merchants, foremen, farmers, came to meet potential wives. It was transactional in a way that most people didn't like to say plainly, but everybody understood. The coordinator in Blackstone Ridge was a woman named Harriet Dole, somewhere in her mid-50s, with a gray bun and the brisk efficiency of someone who had been managing people's disappointment for decades. She met the women from the coach at the door of the cooperative hall, a wide room that smelled of pine resin and boot polish, with a long table at the far end and mismatched chairs arranged along the walls. "Welcome to Blackstone Ridge," Harriet said, in a tone that was not unwelcoming but was also clearly not the beginning of a long speech. "Selection begins at 9 tomorrow morning. Tonight you'll be housed 2 to a room at the Douglas boarding house, 1 street over. Meals at 6 and 6:30. Questions after you've settled." There were 11 women in the group. Delilah was the oldest by at least 5 years. She had known, registering with the Blackstone Ridge platform, that her profile had already been declined at 7 prior locations. The platform system didn't hide that information. It was right there in the file, a column of dates next to a column of towns, each one a small, recorded failure. She had filled out the Blackstone Ridge application anyway, because the alternative was going home to her sister's house in Caldwell and spending the rest of her life sleeping in the back bedroom where the wallpaper was peeling off the corner above the window. That had been the arithmetic she was working with. Her roommate at the Douglas boarding house was a young woman named Penelope Walsh, 23, with dark eyes and the kind of natural confidence that didn't require any maintenance. Penelope was from a farm family in eastern Nebraska, sensible and plain-spoken, and she didn't treat Delilah with Charlotte's particular brand of careful condescension. She just talked to her like a person. They ate supper together at the long table in the boarding house dining room. Salt pork and boiled potatoes, which Delilah ate more of than she probably should have. And Penelope talked about her family and her reasons for coming. Her father had died the previous spring. Her mother had 4 other children to manage. Penelope had applied to the bride platform not out of desperation, but out of practicality, because marriage on the frontier was a different calculation than marriage back east. Out here, 2 people working together could survive. Alone was harder. "What about you?" Penelope asked, cutting through her potato with efficient strokes. "What brought you here?" Delilah considered the question honestly. "This is my 8th registration," she said. Penelope didn't flinch or perform surprise the way Charlotte would have. She just nodded. 7 times not chosen. 7 times not chosen. "What do you think the problem is?" It was such a direct question that Delilah almost smiled. "You're looking at it," she said. Penelope studied her for a moment, then went back to her plate. "Men are short-sighted," she said, as a plain statement of fact rather than comfort. "Most people are," Delilah said. "That's not a criticism. It's just how vision tends to work." The morning of the selection was cold and bright, with a wind off the ridge that smelled like pine and iron. The 11 women gathered in the cooperative hall at 8:30, arranged in whatever configuration they felt comfortable with. Charlotte and May stood near the front. Penelope stood in the middle. Delilah stood toward the back, not from self-defeat exactly, but from something more like clarity. She had done this enough times now that she had lost the anxious, forward-leaning quality of the earlier registrations. She was here. She would see what happened. She had learned to stop performing hope, because performed hope was its own kind of exhausting. The men began arriving at 9. Harriet Dole had explained the process the night before. The men would circulate, have brief conversations, and by noon, each man could formally express interest to the coordinator. Women could accept or decline. Mutual interest would be noted and courtship discussions could begin. It was an odd system, and everyone knew it was odd, but it was the system available, so people used it. Delilah watched it unfold the way she always did. The younger men went directly to Charlotte. That happened within the first 4 minutes. A tall man with a sunburned neck and good boots spent nearly 20 minutes talking to Penelope, who kept her composure admirably and seemed genuinely interested in return. A merchant, stocky, pleasant-faced, maybe 40, worked his way through several conversations and paused briefly in front of Delilah to ask where she was from, nodded at her answer, and then moved on without particular urgency. She stood straight and kept her expression neutral. By 11 o'clock, she had been in 4 brief conversations. 2 had been polite and swift. 1 had been genuinely friendly, but had led nowhere. The 4th man had looked at her with something very close to visible relief when she excused herself, as if she'd read his expression and done him the favor of leaving. She had, in fact, read his expression, and she had, in fact, done him that favor. By 11:30, 7 women had received expressions of interest. By 1:45, 9. Charlotte had 2 competing interests and was managing the situation with the practiced delight of a woman who had never in her life been left standing. Delilah was one of 2 women remaining. The other was a thin, quiet woman named Agnes, who had come to the frontier after the death of her husband and who seemed mostly to be waiting for the process to simply end. Harriet Dole moved through the room with her ledger, noting everything, and when she passed Delilah's corner, she said quietly, "It's not over yet." "I know," Delilah said. "I'm not upset." She wasn't. That was the strange thing. By the 8th registration, she had arrived at something that wasn't quite acceptance and wasn't quite surrender. It was more like the quiet that comes after you've finally stopped arguing with a fact that isn't going to change. She stood in that cooperative hall in Blackstone Ridge and looked at the assembled activity around her and thought, this is what it is. This is the arithmetic. The clock on the wall read 5 minutes to noon when the door of the cooperative hall opened for the second time that morning, and a man she had never seen walked in. He was not what anyone would call easy to look at, not in an ugly sense, just in the sense that he was a large weathered presence that seemed slightly mismatched with the interior space of the cooperative hall, like a barn door hung in a parlor. He was somewhere in his early 40s, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair carrying the first threads of gray at the temple. He wore a coat that had clearly done years of real work, and the lines around his mouth and eyes were the kind that came not from laughing, but from squinting into long distances and spending extended time in wind. He scanned the room once, his eyes moving the way a man's eyes move when he's used to assessing situations quickly. Harriet Dole intercepted him before he'd crossed the room. Delilah couldn't hear the exchange from where she stood, but she watched Harriet's expression shift through something that might have been mild exasperation. And the man, he had a stillness about him, she noticed, the kind that came from not being particularly concerned about other people's opinions, simply nodded at whatever Harriet was telling him, and looked out at the room again. Nearly every woman remaining was spoken for. Charlotte was in animated conversation with her two interested parties, letting them both believe they had a chance while deciding nothing. Penelope was still talking to the tall man with the good boots. Agnes had drifted toward the window and appeared to be studying the street outside with focused interest, which left Delilah, standing near the back wall. The man looked at her, not the quick dismissive assessment she was accustomed to. He actually looked at her, the way a person looks at something they're trying to figure out. She held his gaze because she had stopped looking away from people who looked at her directly, having learned that looking away tended to confirm whatever judgment they were already forming. He walked over. "You're still available," he said. It wasn't phrased as a question, but it wasn't rude either, just direct. "The evidence suggests that," she said. Something at the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "I'm Ronan Ashcroft. I own a ranch about 4 miles east of town. Delilah Mercer. I'm from Caldwell. How long have you been on the platform?" "This is my 8th registration." He didn't react to that the way most men would have. The slight recoil, the recalibration of assumptions. He just absorbed the information. "Why'd you keep going?" "Because the alternative was going home and staying home," she said, "which is available as an option but didn't seem like the only one." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "I was late getting here this morning. My foreman had a situation with one of the cattle pens. A section of fence came down in the night, and we spent the morning trying to contain the loss. By the time I got into town, most of the selection was done." "I can see that. I wasn't planning to come this year," he said, and it sounded like he was saying it more to himself than to her. "My last foreman's wife. She kept the household running. She left when he did. It's a large ranch. The management side is falling apart. The cattle side I can handle. The rest—" He stopped. "I need a partner, not a decoration. I don't have much patience for decoration." Delilah looked at him steadily. "What are you proposing?" "A 1-month courtship," he said. "You come out to the ranch. You see what the work actually is. I see if you can manage it. At the end of the month, if it's working, we get married. If it's not, I bring you back to town with your expenses covered and your registration continues. And if I decide at the end of the month that I don't want to marry you—" He paused. The pause lasted long enough that she could tell the possibility had not occurred to him in exactly that formulation. "Same thing," he said. "Your choice." She studied him. He was not warm, particularly. He was not charming. There was nothing in his manner that was trying to sell her anything. He was simply standing there, laying out a situation the way he'd lay out a fence line, because it was the practical matter at hand. "All right," she said. "I'll consider it. Harriet has the formal agreement forms." "I know how the platform works," she said, and for the second time something moved at the corner of his mouth. So they met with Harriet Dole together and signed the 1-month courtship agreement, while Charlotte, across the room, was still managing her 2 competing suitors with the pleasure of a woman who had never once had to manage a shortage of options. Delilah signed her name with a steady hand and didn't look around the room. She had done enough looking around rooms like this one. The ride to Ashcroft Ranch took 40 minutes in Ronan's wagon, with Delilah's carpet bag and trunk in the bed behind them and the October wind moving across the grassland in long, cold sweeps. Ronan drove without talking much, which she didn't mind. She watched the country instead. The way the flat ground began to roll and fold as they moved east, the scrub oak and juniper that appeared in the draws, the first cattle she saw in the distance, dark shapes against dry grass. "How large is the ranch?" she asked. "About 12,000 acres working land, more in the lease sections." "How many hands?" "Currently 6. Was 8 before the summer, 2 left after the season." "Why?" He glanced at her sideways. Ranch life is hard and the pay was competitive, but not exceptional. Were they leaving the ranch or leaving the situation? Another sideways glance. What do you mean? A well-run place keeps hands even through a hard summer because they know what they're coming back to. An uncertain place loses people when the season breaks. Which was it? He was quiet for a moment. Uncertain, he said, and the word came out with the particular evenness of a man who doesn't easily admit difficulty. She nodded, not pressing, and turned back to watch the land. Ashcroft Ranch sat on a slight rise above a creek bend, sheltered from the north wind by a stand of cottonwood and a long ridge of gray rock that ran along the property's back line. The main house was large, larger than she'd expected. 2 stories of weathered timber with a covered porch running the full front length. Behind it, a bunkhouse, 2 large barns, a series of working pens, a smaller structure that appeared to be a smokehouse, and a storage building with a list to the left side that suggested the foundation was having trouble. It looked like a place that had once been well managed and was currently going through something difficult. The yard, she noticed immediately, was in a state that went beyond working disorder into something more like accumulated neglect. Equipment left in positions that suggested they'd been set down in the middle of a job and not returned to. A split fence rail in the pen nearest the house that had been there long enough for the mud to dry around it. A kitchen garden along the south side of the house with unpulled dead plants still in the ground from the previous season. She didn't say anything. She was cataloging, not criticizing. Ronan set the brake and stepped down, then came around to help her with the trunk, which she had already begun pulling from the wagon bed. "I'll get that," he said. "I have it," she said, not sharply, but clearly, and he stood back and let her. A man appeared from the larger barn's doorway and walked toward them, mid-50s, compact and weathered, with a slight favoring of his right leg. He stopped a few feet away and took in the situation with the practiced discretion of a man who had learned to show very little on his face. "This is Walt Greer," Ronan said. "My foreman." "Ma'am?" Walt said. "Mr. Greer," Delilah said. Walt's eyes moved over her in the way all their eyes moved over her. A quick inventory, a moment of processing. And then he looked at Ronan. Something passed between them that she wasn't meant to read but read anyway. A small, private exchange of uncertainty. She was used to that too. "I'll show you the house," Ronan said. Odds. The interior of the main house was large, cold, and functional. The kitchen was the warmest room. A big iron stove that clearly got the most use. A long pine table, shelves of provisions that were reasonably stocked. The parlor had furniture that had originally been good quality and was now somewhere in the middle distance between lived in and abandoned. A desk against the wall near the front window was buried under papers. Receipts, supply orders, letters, at least 2 ledger books with their covers warped from being left open in a damp room. The bedroom off the main parlor, Ronan explained without quite meeting her eyes, was currently his. There was a room at the top of the stairs, the largest of the upper rooms that had been the previous housekeeper's. It was prepared. "Thank you," she said. "Meals are usually at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening. The hands eat in the bunkhouse. Occasionally someone eats here. It varies." "Who's been managing the household since the foreman's wife left?" "I've been managing it, after a fashion." She looked at the desk covered in papers, at the kitchen shelves where the organization, such as it was, appeared to have been done by someone who put things where there was space rather than where they belonged. "All right," she said. He showed her the upper room, which was plain and clean and cold, with a window facing the creek and the cottonwoods. A bed, a wardrobe, a small table with a basin. He'd clearly made an effort here. The quilt was straight, there were extra blankets folded at the foot, someone had swept the floor recently. "It's fine," she said. "Supper's at 6, he said, and went back downstairs. Oh. She spent the rest of that afternoon unpacking her trunk, learning the geography of the house, and thinking. By the time she'd been in the house 3 hours, she had identified the following. The supply inventory was being tracked but not managed proactively, so shortages were being discovered at the point of need rather than anticipated. The kitchen was workable, but several key storage areas were not being used properly, leading to waste. The parlor desk's paperwork appeared to include at least 1 unpaid supplier account that was probably now overdue. And the structural list of the storage building she'd seen from the yard was almost certainly a drainage issue that had been ignored through at least one wet season. She wrote none of this down. She kept it in her head, which was where she kept most things, and she went downstairs at 5:30 to start supper. Ronan appeared in the kitchen doorway at 5:55 and stopped when he saw the table set and something actually cooking on the stove, instead of the salt pork and bread combination that appeared to have constituted most of his recent meals based on the pattern of what was depleted in the pantry. "I found some dried beans and the last of what looked like a decent ham hock," she said, without turning around. "It's not much, but it's hot." He sat down at the table without a word. They ate in silence that was not uncomfortable. The food was plain and there wasn't an excess of it, but it was better than what had clearly been happening in that kitchen, and he ate with the concentrated attention of a man who had been subsisting rather than eating. "The storage building," she said at the end of the meal. He looked up. "The one with the lean. It's a drainage problem. The foundation on the north side is sitting in water every time it rains. You probably have another season, maybe two, before it becomes a serious repair or a loss." Silence. "I could be wrong," she added. "I'm not a builder, but that's what it looks like from outside. You noticed that this afternoon." "I notice things," she said. He looked at her across the plain table in the plain kitchen of his large, struggling ranch, and something in his expression shifted very slightly, like a man recalibrating a distance. "Walt mentioned the drainage last spring," he said. "I told him we'd address it after the summer season." "Did you?" "No." She stood and began clearing the plates. He didn't move immediately, just sat there with his hands around his coffee cup, and she could feel him watching her with that same focused, figuring quality she'd noticed in the cooperative hall. "You're not what I expected," he said finally. She set the plates in the basin and turned on the water from the pitcher. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," he said, and that was honest enough that she believed it. The first week was a negotiation conducted almost entirely without words. The ranch hands treated her with a range of attitudes that ran from cautiously polite to outright skeptical. There were 6 of them. Walt, the foreman, who was professional and quiet. A young man named Cody Birch, who was 19 and tried hard not to stare. 2 brothers from Texas, Hector and Luis Vega, who were good workers but spoke mostly to each other. An older hand named Patrick Drum, who had opinions about everything and shared them with the candid bluntness of a man who'd stopped worrying about consequences sometime in his 60s. And a tall, taciturn figure named Everett Cross, who had been on the ranch the longest and appeared to have decided to reserve judgment until there was more evidence. Patrick Drum provided the first significant moment of friction on the 4th day. She was in the kitchen garden that afternoon, pulling the dead plants that had been sitting since the previous season, when Patrick came around the corner of the house heading for the tool shed and stopped when he saw her. "That's not typically a man's work," he said, "but it ain't typically what we'd bring a wife here for either." "I'm not technically a wife yet," she said, pulling a dead tomato stake out of the hard ground. "And this garden is a waste if it goes into spring like this." "The woman before you didn't spend much time in the dirt," Patrick said, leaning against the house wall in the way of a man who was not going anywhere soon. "Mrs. Elias, the foreman's wife. She was a small woman, very neat." "I'm not small," Delilah said, "and I'm not particularly neat. I'm functional." "Ronan ain't easy to live with," Patrick said. "He don't talk much. He works from before light to past dark and expects the same from the people around him. He's fair. I'll say that. He's always fair. But fair's different from warm, if you follow me." "I follow you." 7 women before you didn't take the offer," Patrick said. She looked at him. 8 platforms. I was the one who wasn't chosen, not the one who wasn't offered." Patrick was quiet for a moment, processing the distinction. Then, with something that might have been a grudging respect, "That's a different story." "Yes," she said. "It is." On the 8th day, she went through the desk. She asked Ronan's permission first, finding him in the yard at the end of the day's work, and he looked at her with a tired expression that said he had known this was coming and had been waiting to see when. "It needs doing," he said. "I know. I'm asking if you want me to." He looked at the ground, then back at her. "Yes." She worked through the desk over 2 evenings, sorting into categories: paid, unpaid, urgent, pending, unresolved. The unpaid supplier account she'd identified the first day was 6 weeks overdue and carrying a late charge. There was a property tax notice from the territorial office that had a response deadline 2 weeks out. There was a feed contract for the coming winter that had a pricing clause Ronan had apparently signed without reading carefully, which would cost him significantly more than the standard regional rate if he didn't challenge it in the next 30 days. She brought all of it to him at the kitchen table on the second evening, arranged in order of urgency. He sat across from her and went through it without expression, but she watched his jaw tighten when he reached the feed contract. "Did you read this before you signed it?" she asked. "I signed it in August," he said. "I was in the middle of losing 2 hands and managing the summer muster. The feed agent brought it out to the ranch." "He wrote the pricing clause in on page 3, she said. "The base rate is standard, but there's a volume adjustment tied to winter futures that isn't disclosed up front. You should be able to contest it. The clause isn't standard language, and he presented it as a standard contract." Ronan set the contract down. He was quiet for a long moment. "How do you know contract language?" he said. "My father had a hardware business in Caldwell," she said. "He wasn't well toward the end. I managed the accounts and the supplier contracts for the last 4 years he was in business." "You ran a business." "I ran the parts of the business that he couldn't run anymore, yes." He looked at her again with that recalibrating expression. Then carefully, "He's dead now?" "2 years ago. The business closed. My sister and her husband took the house." She said it plainly, without performance, because it was just the sequence of what had happened. Ronan nodded slowly. "I'll write to the feed agent tomorrow." "I drafted the letter," she said, and slid it across the table. He unfolded it and read it. It was clear and direct and left no room for argument without being aggressive. "This is good," he said. "I know," she said. Something in his expression shifted again. That same small recalibration. But this time it went further, into something she couldn't quite read. He refolded the letter carefully and set it on top of the contract. "Delilah," he said. She waited. "Thank you." She wasn't sure why it hit her the way it did. It was a small thing, a plain thing, 2 words spoken across a kitchen table by a man who clearly didn't say them often. But she had been standing in rooms for 8 months where men looked past her or through her, and she had become so accustomed to that particular transparency that something in her had started to believe it was the permanent condition. "You're welcome," she said, and kept her voice level. The end of the second week brought the first significant test. A woman named Clara Voss came to call. Delilah had heard the name from Penelope, who had written a letter from Blackstone Ridge updating her on local information. Clara Voss was the wife of the largest neighboring ranch owner, Edwin Voss, whose property bordered Ashcroft Ranch on the north side. She was, according to Penelope's letter, a woman of considerable local influence who had opinions about the appropriate presentation of a frontier rancher's wife, and who had apparently already formed an opinion about the bride arrangement at Ashcroft Ranch before it had begun. Clara arrived in a very clean buggy on a Wednesday afternoon, when Ronan was out working the south pasture and Delilah was in the kitchen taking inventory. She was a handsome woman, maybe 10 years older than Delilah, with the composed bearing of someone who had been comfortable in rooms for a long time and expected rooms to be comfortable for her. "Mrs. Mercer," she said at the kitchen door, with a smile that did not reach all the way to her eyes. "Miss Mercer," Delilah said, "we're in the courtship period still." "Of course." Clara looked around the kitchen with the practiced eye of a woman who was noting everything and would discuss it later. "I heard you'd come to help Ronan with the household management. We were all a little surprised by the arrangement." "Were you?" "Well," Clara set down her basket, which contained what appeared to be a jar of preserves and a loaf of bread. Gifts offered with the specific intention of being observed as gifts. "Ronan's always been selective. He's a private man. We've known him for years. He's never shown much interest in the bride platforms." "He was late to the selection," Delilah said. "He almost missed it entirely." Clara's eyes moved over her again. The same inventory, but with more practiced subtlety than the ranch hands used. "Well, you must find it quite different from... Where are you from?" "Caldwell," Delilah said. "Caldwell, a town. I imagine the ranch is quite different." "It's hard work," Delilah said. "I don't mind hard work." There was a pause in which Clara seemed to be deciding whether to be more direct or less direct, and settled for a third option that was neither. "Ronan deserves someone who can really be a presence here." someone the community can look up to. The ranching families in this territory have a certain standing. Delilah looked at her without expression. I was managing a business's accounts, supplier contracts, and inventory before I came here, she said. I've restructured the household management, identified and corrected an overdue supplier account, and caught a fraudulent pricing clause in a feed contract that was going to cost this ranch significant money this winter. I've been here 12 days. Clara blinked. I think I can manage the presents, Delilah said. Clara left shortly afterward, with the particular controlled grace of a woman who intended to continue a conversation through other means. Ronan heard about the visit from Walt the following morning. He came to the kitchen before breakfast when Delilah was already at the stove and leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed. Clara Voss came by, he said. She did. Walt said she left looking like she'd been dipped in cold water. I don't know that I'd characterize it that way, Delilah said, turning the bacon. What did she say? She suggested I might not be suited to the social standing of the ranching community. A pause. What did you say? Delilah told him, briefly and accurately. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment, and then something happened that surprised her. He laughed. Not a big laugh, just a short, rough exhalation, as if it had escaped before he decided to let it out. Good, he said. She turned from the stove. You're not concerned about your relationship with the Voss family? Edwin Voss is a fair neighbor and a decent rancher, Ronan said. Clara manages the social calendar. I don't attend the social calendar, so we've been managing fine. He came to the table and sat down. She's been deciding things about this ranch since my wife died. What it should look like. Who should be here. She means well, probably, but she's been deciding things that aren't hers to decide. Delilah turned back to the stove. You were married before. 8 years ago, he said, in the tone of a man stating a fact that is finished. She didn't push. She understood finished facts. Bacon's ready, she said, and set the plate on the table. The courtship month was 3 weeks in when she made the decision. She had not been counting down to the decision the way she might have in an earlier version of herself, waiting anxiously for the verdict, bracing for another rejection. She had been, instead, working. Just working, steadily and consistently, doing the things that needed doing and paying attention to the things that needed attention. The ranch was responding. The desk was clear. The storage building drainage issue had been addressed after she'd spent an evening showing Ronan the specific problem with a lantern and a stick. The solution, which involved regrading the soil on the north side and resetting 2 foundation stones, had taken Walt and Cody 2 days and cost very little. The kitchen garden was turned and ready for spring. The supply orders for winter were going in organized and proactively, instead of being assembled in crisis mode when something ran short. The ranch hands were shifting. Patrick Drum, who had appointed himself the resident commentator, had started including her in his opinions, as if she were part of the natural audience, stopping by the kitchen in the afternoon to relay whatever he found interesting about the day's work, in the manner of a man who had simply added a new stop to his habitual route. Cody Birch had stopped trying not to look at her, and now just looked at her normally, the way he looked at everyone. Walt was professionally respectful in a way that had stopped feeling strategic and started feeling genuine. Even Everett Cross had said 4 words to her voluntarily, which Cody informed her was practically a speech by Everett's standards. Ronan was harder to read. He was not, she had concluded, a man who performed anything. He said what he meant in the precise amount of words required to say it, and anything beyond that he left to silence. He worked at a pace she found legitimately impressive. Not impressive for a man of 43, impressive for anyone, and he had a quality of focused attention when he was solving a problem that she recognized because she had it herself. When something was wrong with one of the cattle or one of the horses or one of the machines, he went very still and very concentrated, and he didn't stop until he understood the problem completely. He started doing that with her, she realized, going still and concentrated like she was a problem he was trying to fully understand. She wasn't sure what to do with that. On the evening of the 22nd day, they sat on the porch after supper. It had become a habit, the two of them sitting out there in the cold for a half hour before the evening's end, without much conversation, but without the need for it. And Ronan said, looking out at the dark land, "The month ends in 8 days." "I know," she said. "I'd like to formally propose marriage," he said, in the tone of a man reading from a document that was true. "Not because of the household management, though that's been more than I expected, but because you're the steadiest person I've met in a long time, and this ranch needs steady. And because I think—" He stopped, restarted. "I think you see things clearly. You see this place clearly, and you don't seem to be frightened by what you see." She looked at the dark line of the ridge against the sky. "I accept," she said. He turned to look at her. "I've been watching this ranch for 3 weeks," she said. "It's worth working for, and you—" She weighed the words. "You said you wanted a partner, not a decoration. I believe you meant it. I've been looking for someone who meant it for longer than 8 months." She paused. "That's enough for me." He was quiet for a moment. "That's enough for me too," he said. They sat for a while longer in the cold and the dark, not talking, the land around them running out to the blue-black ridge, and the first hard stars beginning to show through the breaking cloud, and Delilah felt something she had almost forgotten existed. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but something quieter and more durable than happiness. The sense that she was somewhere she was supposed to be. They were married 3 weeks later in the Blackstone Ridge courthouse, with Harriet Dole and Walt Greer as witnesses. It was not a long ceremony. There were no flowers. Ronan wore his good coat. Delilah wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she'd ordered from the dry goods store, a deep blue wool that she thought was better than anything she'd have been able to buy in town. When it was done and they were back in the wagon heading east toward the ranch, Ronan said, "You look good in that dress." She looked at him sideways. "I mean it," he said, in the plain, factual way he said everything. "Thank you," she said. The road unrolled ahead of them into the golden October afternoon, through the rolling grassland and the scrub oak draws, past the first cattle on the far hillside, toward the rise above the creek bend and the big house with the covered porch, and the 6 men who were now, technically, her household as much as his. She watched the land coming toward her and thought about the 8 platforms and the 7 rejections and the morning in the Blackstone Ridge Cooperative Hall, standing in the back near the wall with the quiet that came after you stopped arguing with arithmetic. She thought about how arithmetic could be wrong. She thought about how the thing you spend the longest time waiting for sometimes arrives through a back door, late, wearing a working coat, looking nothing like what you'd imagined. The wagon rolled on. The ridge mountains sat blue and distant on the horizon. Ahead of them, home. The winter came to Ashcroft Ranch the way most hard things came. Not all at once, but incrementally, each day a little colder than the last, the ground hardening by degrees until the morning frost stayed on the grass past noon, and the creek at the property's edge began to form a thin skin of ice along its shallows. Delilah had been a married woman for 6 weeks. It was nothing like she had imagined marriage would be, back in the years when she'd still been imagining it. It was louder and more physical and less romantic than the version she'd carried around in her head. More about the particular smell of 6 working men's worth of laundry and the logistics of getting a winter's worth of firewood stacked before the serious cold arrived than about anything softer. But it was real, and she had come to understand in those 6 weeks that real was what she'd actually been after all along. The imagined version of things had never suited her temperament anyway. She and Ronan had settled into a domestic arrangement that was functional and, in its own undemonstrative way, respectful. He did not interfere with how she ran the house. She did not second-guess how he ran the cattle operation. They consulted each other on things that crossed both territories: the supply budget, the condition of the working pens, what to do about the fact that one of the bunkhouse's interior walls had apparently been harboring a draft since the previous owner's time. They ate supper together every evening. They sat on the porch after, when the weather permitted, and sometimes talked, and sometimes didn't. It was a partnership conducted in practical terms, which was what they had both agreed to. Whether it was becoming something else was a question neither of them had raised. The community, however, had opinions, and the community was not as restrained about raising them. The first organized social event of the winter season was the Territorial Ranchers Association dinner, held at the Voss property the second Saturday of November. It was, Walt told her matter-of-factly while she was reviewing the week's supply order, the main social event of the fall season for the ranching families in the territory. Most of the significant ranch owners would be there. Their wives would be there. Attendance was effectively obligatory for anyone who wanted to maintain standing in the territory's working relationships. "Does Ronan usually go?" she asked. "He usually goes and leaves early," Walt said. "He don't enjoy it." "Does he know I'll be expected to attend with him?" Walt looked at her with the expression of a man who was carefully not having an opinion. "I imagine he knows," he said. She found Ronan in his barn that evening, checking the condition of one of the mares who had been off her feed for 2 days. He was crouched beside the horse, running his hand along her foreleg with the focused attention he brought to everything, and he didn't look up when she came in. "The Voss dinner is Saturday," she said. "I know." "Are we going?" He was quiet for a moment, still examining the mare's leg. "We should," he said. "Then we are," she said. "I'll need to know what time we're leaving." He looked up then. "You're not nervous about it?" She thought about Clara Voss's visit, the jar of preserves left on the kitchen table with its particular undercurrent of judgment. She thought about what she knew the evening would involve, rooms full of people who had already decided what they thought of her, who would be watching her with the same practiced inventory look she'd been reading all her adult life. "I'm always a little nervous," she said. "I just don't let it run the schedule." He held her gaze for a moment, then went back to the mare. 6 o'clock, he said. The Voss property was grander than Ashcroft Ranch, in the way that properties were sometimes grander when their owners cared more about appearance than function. The main house was large and freshly painted. The yard had been organized for the occasion, and the interior, when they arrived, had been arranged with the careful deliberateness of someone who had spent the better part of a week making everything look effortless. Clara Voss received them at the door. She wore deep green silk, and her composure was immaculate in a way that announced it was immaculate. And when her eyes moved to Delilah, they did the inventory with somewhat more practiced subtlety than at their first meeting, but with the same essential quality underneath. "Ronan," Clara said warmly. Then to Delilah, "Mrs. Ashcroft, I'm so glad you could come." "Thank you for the invitation," Delilah said, in a tone that was perfectly pleasant and entirely opaque. The room was full. Probably 30 people, the core of the territory's ranching community. Men in good coats, women in their best dresses, everyone carrying the specific social tension of a gathering that was simultaneously about pleasure and about business and about status, though nobody would have said the last part out loud. Ronan moved through the room with the manner of a man honoring a social obligation, speaking when spoken to, not lingering. Delilah moved with him for the first half hour, then understood, from the particular geometry of the room's social circulation, that she was expected to separate and engage independently, as the wives did. She moved toward a group of women near the fireplace. There were 4 of them: Clara's sister-in-law, a woman named Frances, who was pleasant in a vague way, 2 younger wives whose names Delilah caught as Helen and Marjorie, and a woman in her 40s named Ruth Calhoun, whose husband ran the territory's largest feed operation and who had the same quality Delilah had, the quality of not performing anything. Ruth looked at her when she approached and said simply, "You're the Ashcroft bride." "I am," Delilah said. "People have been talking about you." "I assumed." "I heard you caught a fraudulent clause in a feed contract," Ruth said, with the directness of someone who found directness efficient. "Millard Howe's contract, wasn't it?" "I don't know his first name," Delilah said. "The agent who presented the contract to Ronan in August." "That's Millard Howe. He's done that before." Ruth looked at her with frank appraisal. "Ronan didn't catch it. He was managing the summer muster and a staffing problem at the time. He signed it without reading the pricing annex." "Most men don't read the pricing annex," Ruth said. "That's how Millard makes his money." She took a sip of the wine she was holding. "Where'd you learn contract language?" "My father's hardware business," Delilah said. "I managed accounts and supplier contracts." Ruth seemed to be filing this away. "And before that?" "Before that, I was just paying attention," Delilah said. Ruth looked at her for another moment and then did something small and significant. She laughed, genuinely, without performance. "I like you," she said. "I wasn't expecting to." "Most people aren't," Delilah said. From across the room, she caught Ronan watching her. Just briefly, his eyes moving from the conversation he was in to where she was standing, registering something, then returning. She looked away before she could decide what that something had been. The evening's main trouble arrived in the form of a man named Douglas Farrell, Farrell owned a mid-sized ranch on the territory's western edge, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had learned in early life that his opinions landed well with a certain kind of audience. He was handsome in an obvious way, and he clearly knew it, and he had the habit of speaking a little too loudly in social situations, so that his remarks were consistently available to more people than just their stated audience. He arrived beside Delilah and Ruth near the end of the first hour, when Ruth had drifted off to speak with her husband, and he looked at Delilah with the frank, appraising look of a man who was not particularly interested in being subtle. "You're Ronan's new wife," he said. "Yes," she said. "The bride platform woman." He said it as a neutral descriptor, but loaded it with something that wasn't neutral. "I heard you came in from Caldwell, was it? Through the cooperative." "That's right. Must be quite an adjustment," he said. "Ranch life, it's demanding. Not everyone takes to it." "I seem to be taking to it fine," she said. "Well," he glanced around the room in the particular way of a man making sure he has an audience. "It's early days. Some women find it harder than they expected, especially when they haven't grown up with it. When the work gets serious." She looked at him steadily. "I reorganized the supply management, resolved an overdue supplier account, and identified a fraudulent pricing clause in a major feed contract in my first 2 weeks," she said. "In my third week, I identified a foundation drainage problem that would have been a significant repair by spring. The week after that, I managed the household inventory short by 12% when the autumn delivery arrived incomplete, without any interruption to operations. What kind of serious work were you concerned I couldn't manage?" The silence that followed was brief but notable. A woman nearby, she caught it in her peripheral vision, had very carefully stopped moving. Farrell's expression cycled through something and arrived at a fixed smile. "Well," he said again, "I meant no offense." "None was registered," she said pleasantly. He moved away shortly after. Across the room, she heard, distinctly, Ruth Calhoun laugh. On the ride home, the cold had deepened and the stars were hard and numerous above the dark land. Ronan drove without speaking for several minutes, and then said, "What did you say to Douglas Farrell?" "I told him what I'd accomplished at the ranch in the first month," she said. Another silence. "He had it coming," Ronan said, in a tone that was so flat it took her a second to register that it was also satisfied. "He has the habit of talking around women to make sure other people are listening," she said. "I just made sure the other people were hearing something accurate." "Ruth Calhoun thinks very highly of you," he said. "I could tell from across the room." "Ruth Calhoun is the most straightforward person in that room," Delilah said. "I liked her immediately. Her husband's a good man. He runs a fair business." Ronan looked ahead at the road. "You did well tonight." She looked at him sideways. "You were watching." "Some." "You don't enjoy those evenings," she said. "I never have." "Why do you go?" He considered. "Because the relationships matter. The Calhouns, the Hawthorns, even the Vosses. We share water rights, grazing boundaries, market access. The dinner is the maintenance work on the relationships." "But you hate the performance of it," she said. He glanced at her, and for a moment the line of his face in the cold dark was simply tired, the way faces looked when they stopped performing. "I was never good at the social part," he said. "My wife was." A brief pause. "Margaret, she made it look easy. The way she moved through a room. After she died, I just went and endured it." It was the most he'd said about Margaret in a single stretch. She could feel the weight of it. Not guilt exactly, not grief exactly, just the heaviness of something that had shaped him and still occupied significant territory. "I'm not Margaret," she said. "I don't move through rooms the way she did, I imagine." "No," he said. "You move through them differently." A pause. "It's not worse." She turned back to the road. They were coming over the last rise before the ranch now, and she could see the lights in the bunkhouse window and the dark shape of the main house against the sky. "She was sick?" Delilah asked. "Fever," he said. "The second winter. It came on fast." His voice carried the flatness of a man who had said this enough times that the words had worn smooth, but the thing underneath was still there, unchanged by the repetition. "The ranch was smaller then. We had plans." She didn't offer comfort, because she could tell he wasn't asking for it. She just sat with it alongside him, which seemed to be what he actually needed. The wagon came down the last grade toward home. December arrived, and with it the full weight of the frontier winter, and the ranch shifted into the harder rhythms of the cold season, checking water sources, supplementing feed, managing the cattle's condition against the temperature, watching the sky. Delilah had found her footing in the household with enough confidence now that she was beginning to see past its edges. She had been watching the ranch hands for 2 months, and what she saw was a group of men who were skilled at their work but operating as individuals rather than as a coordinated team, each doing his own portion, managing his own knowledge, with no real system for sharing information or coordinating effort across the property. She started small. She began keeping a chalkboard in the kitchen that listed the daily status of the main concerns: water source conditions, cattle health flags, equipment issues, supply levels. It wasn't directed at anyone. She just kept it current and accurate. Within 2 weeks, the hands had started looking at it in the morning when they came in for coffee, and within 3 weeks, they'd started contributing to it. Cody writing in a water trough status from the north pasture, Walt noting a fence issue in the east section. Patrick Drum noticed what she'd done one morning and stood looking at the board with his coffee cup in his hand. "You made us a system," he said. "I made a board," she said. "Same thing," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't quite the territory of compliment, but was adjacent to it. The bigger test came in the second week of December, when the winter supply delivery arrived from Blackstone Ridge and was short by more than just 12%. The freight carrier had managed to deliver roughly 2/3 of the order. The rest had apparently been left at the depot due to a wagon breakdown and would arrive, the carrier's note said, at some indeterminate point in the coming weeks. Ronan came in at noon and read the note and looked at the inventory and set the note down on the table with a controlled care that meant he was angry. "We're short on salt for the cattle mineral supplement," he said. "We're short on lamp oil, flour, and dried goods. We've got maybe 3 weeks of adequate supply, and then we're going into shortage." "I've already made the list," Delilah said, from where she was standing by the shelves. "The critical item is the salt. The rest we can manage with rationing. We won't be comfortable, but we won't be in crisis. The salt is the problem." "There's no source between here and Blackstone Ridge," he said. "There's a Calhoun distribution point 12 miles south," she said. "Ruth mentioned it at the dinner. They carry bulk cattle mineral. It's not on the standard freight route, but it's accessible by wagon." He looked at her. "I wrote to Ruth last week asking about it," she said, "in case this happened. I got a response yesterday." She put the letter on the table beside the carrier's note. "She says they have stock and she'll hold 50 pounds against our account until we can get someone there." Ronan read the letter. He set it down. He looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of a man letting something go that he'd been holding. "You anticipated this," he said. "I anticipated it might happen," she said. "The carrier's been running behind since October. Walt mentioned it. I thought it was worth having a contingency." "I didn't think to do that," he said. "You were managing 20 other things," she said. That's not an excuse." "No," she said, "but it's a reason." He looked at her for a long moment. Something in the set of his face was different, not just the recalibrating expression she'd come to recognize, but something more personal than that, more exposed. "What do you need from me to make this work?" he said. "Send Cody and Hector to the Calhoun point tomorrow," she said. "I'll have the order ready. And write to the freight carrier. Not an angry letter, a formal one that establishes what was missing and when it needs to arrive. I'll draft it if you want." "Draft it," he said. "Please." The please was not something he'd been in the habit of adding. She noticed and didn't say anything and went to find the writing paper. But Christmas that year was nothing like a celebration and everything like a marker. Delilah had not expected to make much of it. The ranch was running, the weather was holding just above brutal, and there was real work happening every day that left everyone, herself included, too tired for elaborate observance. But she woke on Christmas morning and found Ronan already in the kitchen, which was unusual, and he had made coffee badly and was standing at the window looking out at the gray frozen yard with his back to the door. She came in and poured her own cup and stood beside him at the window. Outside, the land was white and still. The cottonwoods along the creek had their bare branches frosted. The cattle in the near pasture were dark shapes against the snow, moving slowly. The light was the particular flat, diffuse white of a winter morning, making everything look like a photograph of itself. "It's quiet," she said. "Always is this time of year," he said. They stood for a while. She could feel the particular quality of the silence. Not uncomfortable, not exactly companionable, but something more complex than either. "Merry Christmas," he said, still looking out the window. "Merry Christmas," she said. He set his cup down and left the room, and came back a few minutes later with something, a length of blue ribbon and a small package wrapped in brown paper, tied with a piece of twine. He set it on the table in front of her with the careful self-consciousness of a man who was not comfortable with this kind of gesture. She picked it up. Inside the paper was a small leather journal, well made with thick cream pages. "For the supply tracking," he said, a little quickly. "You've been keeping notes on loose paper. I thought—" "I love it," she said. He looked at her. She was looking at the journal, running her thumb along the leather cover, feeling the quality of it. It was not a showy gift. It was specific. It was the gift of someone who had been paying attention to what she actually did, what she actually needed. She looked up. "Thank you, Ronan," she said, and this time the two words carried more weight than they had at the kitchen table in October. He held her gaze for a moment, then looked back out the window. "There's something for the hands, too," he said, in the brisker voice of a man re-establishing normal operating procedure. "Walt's organizing it." "Good," she said, and went to start breakfast, holding the journal against her side like something she intended to keep. The new year came in cold and hard, and with it came the community's continued reassessment of the woman at Ashcroft Ranch. Ruth Calhoun had become, gradually and without ceremony, the closest thing Delilah had to a friend in the territory. They exchanged letters weekly and met in Blackstone Ridge once a month when Delilah came in with Ronan for the supply run. Ruth was sharp and economically literate and unimpressed by social performance, which meant she and Delilah talked about actual things rather than the performance of things, which Delilah found more valuable than she'd expected. In January, Ruth mentioned during one of their Blackstone Ridge meetings that Douglas Farrell had told Edwin Voss that Ronan's arrangement had been a mistake, that a woman without frontier background, without proper social standing, from a bride platform, would eventually create problems for the Ashcroft operation's reputation in the territory. Delilah listened to this without expression. "He said it to Edwin, not to Clara," Ruth said. "Edwin told my husband. He didn't say it as endorsement, more as reporting what he'd heard." "What does Edwin think?" Delilah asked. "Edwin's a practical man," Ruth said. "He thinks whoever keeps the Ashcroft accounts in order is a benefit to the territory's business relationships." A pause. "He also thinks Douglas Farrell talks too much." "He's right on both counts," Delilah said. She went home from that trip and did not mention the conversation to Ronan, not because she was hiding it, but because she'd decided it didn't require action. Farrell's opinion was Farrell's opinion. What mattered was the work. But she thought about it, that evening on the porch, in the cold January dark, with her breath making small clouds. She thought about the 8 platforms and the 7 rejections and the accumulated weight of other people's assessments, and she thought about how much of her life she had spent braced against that weight, standing straight under it, refusing to let it fold her. The difference now, she was beginning to understand, was that she was standing in a place where the bracing had become something else. Not resistance to external judgment, but simply solidity. The knowledge that she had built something real here, something that held weight, something that functioned. She heard the front door and Ronan came out and sat in the other chair. And they were quiet in the way they were quiet sometimes, not needing to fill it. "Farrell's been talking," she said after a while. "I heard," he said. She looked at him. "You knew." "Walt heard it from one of the Voss hands last week." He looked out at the dark. "I wasn't going to bother you with it." "It doesn't bother me," she said. "I just wanted to know you knew. Farrell talks because he's bored and he's ambitious and he thinks my operation is underperforming its land value," Ronan said, with an evenness that told her he'd been thinking about this for a week and had arrived at a settled position. "He's been trying to get access to our eastern grazing section for 2 seasons. The talking is connected to that. He wants the land. He wants the lease rights to the eastern section if we can't fully utilize it." He looked at her. "We can fully utilize it. We just haven't had the organizational capacity." "We do now," she said. "We do now," he said. She looked back out at the dark land. The stars were out, hard and numerous, the winter sky enormous above the ridge. "Are you going to be all right with people like Farrell in this territory?" Ronan asked. His voice was carefully level, but there was something underneath it. A question inside the question, something he was trying to get at without quite getting at it directly. She thought about what he was actually asking, not whether she could handle social friction, which he'd already seen evidence she could. He was asking whether she would stay, whether the accumulated weight of other people's opinions about her place here would eventually become enough to make her leave. "I've been standing in rooms where people had opinions about me since I was about 17 years old," she said. "I'm 32 now. I've had a lot of practice not leaving." He was quiet for a moment. "Good," he said, and the word was plain and simple, but there was something in it, some quality of genuine relief that she felt settle somewhere in her chest. They sat there in the cold and the dark and the large quiet of the frontier night, and the ranch around them held its winter breath, and nothing between them was said about what the Christmas journal had meant or what the word good had meant, because they were not yet people who said those things directly. But it was there, in the space between them, real and accumulating, the way the cold accumulated, not all at once, but by degrees, each day more settled than the last. February on the frontier had a particular quality of endurance to it, not the sharp, dramatic cold of December, which at least had the dignity of being extreme, but the grinding, gray persistence of a cold that had been going on long enough that people had stopped talking about it and simply moved through it, heads down, doing what needed doing. Delilah had learned to read the sky. It was something Ronan had been doing automatically for as long as she'd known him. That habit of looking up and west before making any significant decision about the day's work. And she had started doing it herself without quite noticing when the habit had formed. The February sky had been carrying a particular weight for 3 days, a low, pressed-down quality to the clouds that was different from the usual winter overcast, a stillness in the air that the horses were responding to before any human had named what it meant. Walt named it on the morning of the 4th day. He came in for the early coffee and stood at the kitchen window and said, without preamble, "That's a blizzard building." Ronan was already at the table with the day's plan written on a piece of paper in front of him. He didn't look up immediately. "How long?" "Hits tonight, I'd say. Maybe early morning at the latest." Walt turned from the window. "Wind's wrong. This one's going to be bad." The table went quiet in the particular way it went quiet when the men were thinking fast and not talking. Delilah set down the coffee pot and looked at her own mental inventory, where everything was, what condition the supplies were in, what the vulnerable points were. "How many cattle are still in the north section?" she asked. Walt glanced at her. "About 60 head. We've been running them on the supplemental hay up there since the east pasture went. They need to come in before the storm hits," she said. "That's a 4-hour drive minimum," Cody said, from his seat near the door. "Then we have about 6 hours before we lose the light, and the weather turns," Ronan said. He folded the paper in front of him and stood. "Walt, take Hector and Luis. Start the north drive now. Cody? Everett? I need the south pen reinforced before noon. The east gate has been working loose, and it'll go in a high wind." "What about the hay stores?" Patrick asked. "Delilah," Ronan said, and looked at her directly in the way he had come to look at her when he needed the practical accounting to be accurate. "What's our hay situation?" 3 weeks of full ration if we don't waste," she said immediately, because she'd checked 4 days ago and updated the journal that morning. 2 weeks if the storm extends and we have to increase the supplement. We have enough for a standard blizzard. If it runs longer than 10 days, we start making choices." "It won't run 10 days, Walt said, though his voice didn't carry total conviction. "We'll plan for 10 anyway," Ronan said. He looked around the table. "Let's move." The kitchen emptied fast, boots on the porch boards, the cold coming in as the door swung. Delilah was already at the shelves, pulling the emergency lamp oil to the front, checking the wick supply. There was a sequence to this kind of preparation, the things that needed to happen first so the things after them could happen. And she ran through it in her head while her hands moved. She had 6 hours. The cattle drive came in at 4 in the afternoon, with the sky having shifted from gray to something darker and more purposeful overhead. She watched from the yard as Walt brought the herd down from the north, Hector and Luis working the flanks with the particular controlled urgency of men who could feel the weather in the back of their necks. 63 head, pushing through the gate in a packed, anxious mass. One of them had a leg issue, favoring the right front, and Ronan cut her out immediately and moved her to the sheltered pen near the barn. "She'll need watching tonight," he said to Cody. "I'll take the first watch," Cody said. "I'll take second," Everett said, which was 3 words more than Everett usually volunteered, which told Delilah something about how seriously he was reading the weather. The wind picked up at 5. By 6, when the hands came in from the last of the outdoor work, it had a sound to it. Not howling yet, but that low, pressing moan that preceded a serious storm. The kind of sound that made people go quiet without deciding to. Supper that night was louder than usual, which she recognized as the thing people did when they were sitting inside and the weather was building outside, filling the indoor space with talk to offset what was happening on the other side of the walls. Patrick was in good form, telling a story about a blizzard he'd been caught in 15 years ago in Montana that she suspected was half embellished, but was genuinely entertaining. Cody listened with the focused attention of a young man cataloging information that might someday be useful. Even Everett ate an extra biscuit, which Cody caught and raised an eyebrow about. Ronan ate steadily and mostly listened, and she noticed his eyes going to the window every few minutes. Not nervously, just checking. The sky outside had gone completely dark by 5:30, and now there was nothing to see in the glass but the reflection of the kitchen interior, which somehow made the dark outside feel more absolute. After supper, he stood at the kitchen window for a long time. "You should sleep while you can," she said, from where she was cleaning up. "I'm going to check the cattle one more time before it fully hits," he said. "Walt already did a check at 7. "I know." He pulled his coat from the hook. "I want to see the herd myself, the injured one especially." She looked at him. "The storm's moving fast," she said. "Walt said by midnight." "I'll be back in an hour," he said. He buttoned his coat with the quick efficiency of someone who'd been working in cold weather for 20 years. "Bolt the door after me and keep the kitchen lamp burning." "Ronan," he looked at her. She had things she could have said. Practical things about the wind direction and the speed at which these storms moved on the ridge. Things she'd been learning since October and had filed away with the same attention she gave everything. But she also knew this man well enough now. 6 months of mornings and evenings and the long, cold silences of winter, to know that he was not going to be argued out of checking his cattle before a storm. It was not stubbornness exactly. It was the specific responsibility of a man who understood that those animals depended entirely on what the people around them did or didn't do. 1 hour, she said. 1 hour, he said, and went out. She bolted the door and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand still on the bolt, listening to his footsteps cross the porch, and then the yard. And then the wind swallowed the sound. Oh. At 11 o'clock, he had not come back. She was not panicking. She was doing what she always did, which was assess the situation accurately and make a plan. The storm had hit an hour early. The wind was serious now, rattling the window frames, and she'd watched from the upstairs window as the first real snow began horizontal, not falling but driven, the kind of snow that got into every gap and covered distances fast. 1 hour had become 2. She told herself there were practical explanations. The injured cow, a fence issue he'd spotted on his way out, the storm moving faster than expected and him making the sensible decision to shelter in the barn rather than cross the open yard in deteriorating visibility. She went to the bunkhouse. She knocked loud enough to be heard over the wind, and Walt opened the door with the alert expression of a man who had not been fully asleep. "Ronan went to check the cattle at 8, she said. "He hasn't come back." Walt's expression didn't change dramatically, but something behind his eyes sharpened. He turned back into the bunkhouse and said, "Cody, Everett, up." She stood in the doorway while they moved. The wind pushed at her back with a physical insistence. "He said the main barn," she said. "Possibly the injured cow's pen." "Main barn is 40 yards, Walt said, pulling on his coat. "In this visibility, that's manageable. The north pen is a different matter." "He wouldn't have gone to the north pen once the storm hit," Cody said, from behind Walt. "That'd be—" He stopped himself. "Check the main barn first," Delilah said. "I'll keep the kitchen lamp burning in the window so you have a light to orient on." "Yes, ma'am," Walt said, and he said it with none of the residual uncertainty she'd heard in that phrase in October. He said it like a man who trusted the person giving the instruction. She went back to the main house and turned the kitchen lamp as high as it would go and set it in the window, and then stood there and did not think about what she would do if they came back without him. She thought instead about what needed doing. She got the emergency supply box from the back storage, the one she had organized in November after reading through the ranch's old supply records and realizing there had never been a designated emergency kit, just a vague idea that things were somewhere. Bandages, carbolic, 2 wool blankets folded tight, a flask of the whiskey she'd set aside specifically for medical use, a candle, and a tinderbox. She set it on the kitchen table and built the fire up high and put water on to heat. She was not going to think about the alternative. She was going to prepare for his return. They found him at the edge of the north fence line. He had gone further than the main barn. Walt figured later that he'd done the main barn check and found it in order, and then heard something, maybe an animal sound, maybe the fence rattling in a way that concerned him, and moved toward the north pen in the early stages of the storm when visibility was still workable. Then the storm had hit faster than its leading edge had suggested, and in the sudden whiteout conditions, with the wind taking orientation away from you the way a river current takes your footing, he'd gotten turned. He was on the ground when they found him, which was the thing Everett said to her with the controlled economy of a man trying not to alarm her while giving her accurate information. On the ground, but responsive. Hypothermic, not deeply, not to the level of true emergency. But his core temperature was down, and he'd been in the snow long enough that his hands and face were in serious trouble. Cody had one arm, and Walt had the other, and they moved fast across the yard with the lamp in the window guiding them, and she had the door open before they reached the porch. They got him to the kitchen, and she moved. She didn't ask questions, and she didn't make sounds. She had the blankets ready, and the water was almost hot, and she sent Cody for more blankets from the upstairs chest, and she made Walt and Everett step back because 4 people in that space was too many, and she needed to work. Ronan was conscious but slow, that heavy, confused quality of someone whose body had been trying to protect itself by shutting down the periphery. His coat was soaked. His hands were white at the fingertips, and she could see from the set of his face that sensation was gone from them. "I need to get the coat off," she said, and Walt helped with that, and then she wrapped him in the dry blankets and set his hands, carefully, no rubbing, she'd read about that, rubbing was the wrong thing, in a basin of water that was warm but not hot, and she talked to him while she worked. Not the soothing kind of talk that was really for herself, but the practical kind that gave him something concrete to respond to. "Tell me your name," she said. "Ronan Ashcroft." Slow, but there. "Tell me the day." "February." A pause. "15th." "Close enough," she said. "The 14th, but we'll count it. Tell me where we are." "My kitchen," he said, and there was something at the edge of his voice that might have been dark humor if he'd had the energy for it. "That's right," she said. "You're in your kitchen. I'm going to need you to stay awake." "I'm awake." "Stay that way." She worked through the next 2 hours the way she worked through everything, methodically, without wasted motion, her focus narrowed to the immediate problem and its sequence of solutions. The water baths for his hands changed every 15 minutes as the temperature was raised incrementally. Hot tea, when he was coherent enough to drink without spilling. Monitoring the color returning to his fingers. Painful, she knew. The return of circulation was its own kind of agony. And watching his eyes for the sharpness that meant his temperature was coming back. The hand stayed close. Walt sat in the corner chair and didn't leave. Cody made himself useful with the fire. Patrick, who had come over from the bunkhouse when he'd heard the commotion, was uncharacteristically silent, sitting at the table's edge with his coffee going cold in front of him, watching. At 1 a.m, Ronan said, "Sit down, Delilah." She looked at him. "You've been standing for 2 hours," he said. His voice was clearer now, though rough. "Sit down." She sat in the chair closest to him, the emergency supply box still open on the table beside her. "How bad?" he said. "You were hypothermic," she said. "Your hands took the worst of it. The feeling's coming back, which means there probably isn't serious frostbite, but you're going to feel it for a few days." "The cattle." "The cattle are fine," Walt said from his corner. "I checked before we came out looking for you. Everything's in." Ronan closed his eyes briefly, opened them. "I heard the north fence. In the early wind, I thought—" "I know what you thought," Walt said, You thought it was going and you went to check it. Same thing you always do. In a blizzard. Well, Walt said, and there was nothing after the word, which was its own kind of comment. Ronan looked at Delilah. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at the territory sometimes from the porch, like something he was trying to fully take in, the whole scope of it. You had the light in the window, he said. Yes. I could see it from the fence line. He said it simply. That's what I was walking toward. The kitchen was quiet. The storm outside pushed and howled against the walls, but inside the fire was high and the lamp was burning and the room held its warmth against everything outside trying to take it. I was scared, she said. It came out plainly, without strategy, because she was too tired for strategy and because it was simply true. Ronan looked at her. He didn't say anything immediately. His hands were in the warming basin and his color was coming back, and he looked exhausted in the particular way of someone who had recently been close to something they hadn't intended to be close to. I know, he said. I could tell. I don't want you to think it means… She stopped. She wasn't sure what she'd been about to say. That the fear didn't mean anything beyond the practical? That was not true, and she had stopped, in recent months, saying things that weren't true. I don't scare easily, she said instead. I know that too, he said, which is why… He stopped, looked at his hands in the basin, which is why it meant something, seeing the light. The men in the room were very carefully not looking at either of them. Patrick cleared his throat and said something to Cody about checking the fire in the bunkhouse, and the room's population shifted in the direction of the door with the practiced discretion of people removing themselves from a moment they recognized. Walt was the last. He stood from his corner chair and looked at Ronan and said, Glad you made it back. Me too, Ronan said. Walt nodded at Delilah. Not a bow, just a nod, clean and direct, and went out into the storm. They were alone in the kitchen with the fire and the lamp and the blizzard outside working itself against every surface of the house. Ronan's color was mostly back. His hands were still in the basin, but he was managing his own monitoring now, and she had moved her chair a few inches closer without deciding to, and the space between them was different than it had been 6 months ago in the cooperative hall or 3 months ago in this same kitchen with the ledger papers spread between them. I keep thinking about the year Margaret died, he said. He said it quietly, not looking at her, looking at the water in the basin. The fever came on at night. I was in the barn. By the time I came in, it had moved fast. I've always thought… He stopped. I've always thought if I'd been inside, if I'd come in earlier. She understood then what the north fence line had really been about. The compulsive checking, the need to be present at every point of vulnerability on the property. Not just rancher's practicality. It was also a man trying to be in the right place so that he couldn't again be in the wrong one. You weren't in the wrong place, she said. When Margaret was sick, you were doing the work. That's not a failure. He looked at her. You've been carrying that for 8 years, she said. That's a long time to carry something that was never yours to carry. He was quiet for a long while. The storm pushed at the windows. The fire settled lower, and she leaned over and added a piece of wood to it without getting up from the chair. You are not what I expected, he said again. The same words he'd said in October, but they meant something different now. They had the weight of 8 months behind them. You said that before, she said. It keeps being true. His voice was rough, but not from the cold. When I came back across the yard, when I could see the light, I knew you'd be there, that you'd have done what needed doing. I knew it before I got to the door. He paused. I've been alone a long time. I'd stopped expecting to know that someone would be there and would have handled it. She looked at him. His face in the firelight was tired and honest and not performing anything, and she thought about all the ways she had prepared herself, across 8 platforms and 8 months of waiting, to accept that this was not going to happen for her. The particular solitude of a woman who has been told, in the language of other people's choices, that she is not what anyone is looking for. I've been alone a long time too, she said, but differently than you. You were alone after something. I was alone because people looked at me and decided… She stopped, started again. I got very good at expecting nothing. That's not… He looked like he was trying to find the right words and couldn't. That's not right, he said, which was not eloquent but was, she thought, genuine. No, she said. It wasn't. They sat for a while more in the quiet of the kitchen, the storm outside and the fire inside, and the gap between their chairs had closed another inch or two without either of them accounting for it. And at some point, Ronan took his hands from the basin and dried them carefully on the towel, and she looked at the returning color in his fingers and thought, "He's all right. He's going to be all right." "Delilah," he said. "Yes." He looked at her. His eyes had the quality they had when he was trying to say something accurately, which was the same quality they had when he was working out a practical problem. Focused, careful, trying not to miss anything. "I'm glad I walked into that room late," he said. She understood exactly what he meant. The cooperative hall. The door opening 5 minutes before noon. The room mostly settled and her standing near the back wall with the specific quiet of a woman who had stopped arguing with arithmetic. "I'm glad you did too," she said. He reached across the space between their chairs and found her hand, tentatively, not gripping, just covering it with his. His hand was still cold. She didn't move hers away. The blizzard went on outside, working at the house with everything it had. And inside the kitchen, the lamp burned and the fire held, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed saying just then. The thing between them, the accumulating thing, the one neither of them had named through a November dinner and a Christmas journal and a January porch and 6 months of mornings, had arrived in the particular way that real things arrived, not all at once. Not with announcement, but settling into place the way the land settled after a hard thaw, quietly and with the sense that it had always been heading here. Outside, the storm hammered on. Inside, it was warm, and she was not alone, and for the first time in longer than she could easily calculate, neither was he. Mom. The blizzard ran for 3 days. They lost a section of east fence that needed full replacement, and one of the older steers did not survive the second night, which Ronan took with the quiet, accepting sorrow of a man accustomed to the frontier's arithmetic of losses. The injured cow from the north pen pulled through. The hay stores held. The storage building, its drainage issue addressed in November, kept its foundation through the weight of snow and the freeze-thaw of the storm's passing in a way it absolutely would not have survived the previous winter. By the third morning, when the wind had dropped, and the sky had opened into the clean, exhausted blue that followed a serious blizzard, Ronan stood on the porch with both hands wrapped around a coffee cup. They were still tender, still slightly swollen at the knuckles, but fully functional, and looked out at the white world. She stood beside him. 3 weeks of full hay ration, she said. "Ray, we're right on target." "I know," he said. "I checked the journal this morning." She looked at him sideways. He was looking out at the land with the expression of a man taking stock, and he was standing close enough that their shoulders were nearly touching, which had not been the case on October evenings on this same porch. "We need to rebuild the east fence before the spring thaw makes the ground too soft to work," she said. "Walt said Cody and Hector can start on it next week if the cold holds." "I'll talk to Walt," he said. "The steer we lost—" She paused. "I'll adjust the spring market projection." "I already did," he said. She looked at him again. "I've been doing some of the accounting myself," he said, with a careful quality that was very close to embarrassed. "You showed me the system. I thought I should contribute." It was such a small thing, and it was not a small thing at all. She understood that. The man who had handed her a pile of overdue papers in October and said, "Handle it," was now sitting down with the ledger himself because she had built a system worth contributing to. "The projection's off by 1 line," she said. "The replacement steer value needs to come from the insurance account, not the operating account." "I'll fix it," he said. "I know," she said. They stood there on the porch in the cold white morning, looking at the land they had brought through the winter, and the ranch around them was battered and intact, and theirs, fully, completely, equally theirs, and whatever it was that had been accumulating between them since October had settled now into something that neither of them needed to name because they were both already living inside it. Patrick came out of the bunkhouse across the yard, looked up at them on the porch, and raised his coffee cup in their direction. Ronan raised his back. Delilah stood with her shoulder against her husband's arm in the white winter light and watched the territory come back to life after the storm, and felt, for the first time since she could remember, exactly where she was supposed to be. Spring came to Ashcroft Ranch the way it always came to the frontier. grudgingly, in fits and starts, with cold snaps that arrived a week after everyone had decided winter was finished, just to remind people that the land made its own schedule and consulted no one. By late March, the east fence was rebuilt. The ground had softened enough to work, and the ranch had emerged from the blizzard season in better condition than it had entered the previous autumn. That was not an accident, and everyone on the property knew it. The hands moved through their spring work with a different quality than they'd carried in October. Not looser exactly, but more organized, like men who had learned over a winter that the effort they put into preparation came back to them when things got hard. Delilah noticed the shift and didn't comment on it, because commenting on it would have made it self-conscious. What she noticed more in those early spring weeks was the children. She had been seeing them since autumn without quite registering what she was seeing. The Greer grandchildren when Walt's son came to visit. A pair of boys from the Hawthorne Ranch down the road who sometimes appeared at the property line watching the cattle work. The children of the two Vega brothers who had brought their families out from Texas when the spring contracts were signed. They ranged from maybe 6 to 13, and what they had in common, she gradually understood, was that they were simply present on the land during hours when, in any town she'd grown up near, they would have been in a schoolroom. She mentioned it to Ronan one evening in April, sitting at the kitchen table after supper with the ledger between them in the easy way they now shared the accounting work. "The children on the nearby properties," she said. "How many are school age?" He thought about it. Between the Hands families and the neighboring ranches within riding distance, maybe a dozen, could be 15. "Where do they go to school?" "Blackstone Ridge has a schoolhouse," he said. "In town." "It's 12 miles, she said. "Yes." "So they don't go." He looked at her across the table. He had the expression of a man who knew something true was about to cost him something. "Some of them go in winter, when the workload's lighter, and their fathers can take them in. Some of them—" He stopped. "No, most of them don't go consistently." "The Vega boys' children," she said. "Miguel is 8, and I've been watching him. He can't read." "His father doesn't read much English either," Ronan said. "Hector reads some. Luis almost none." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the space above the ledger. "When I was managing my father's business accounts, I was teaching myself out of books I borrowed from the county library, because I had access to books and a reason to learn." She paused. "Miguel doesn't have either." Ronan waited. He had gotten good over the winter at knowing when she was working toward something and giving her the room to work toward it. "I want to start a school," she said. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "Here?" he said. "Here. In the outbuilding. The one off the east barn. The large storage room we cleared last month. It gets the morning light. It's big enough for 15 children if we put in benches." He looked at her steadily. "You want to convert a working outbuilding into a schoolroom?" "Yes. And teach it yourself." "To start. Once it's established, I'll find someone properly qualified to take the primary teaching. But to start, yes." He leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the particular expression that meant he was running the practical objections through his head in the same methodical way she ran supply inventories. She let him run them. She had already run them herself. "The parents would need to agree," he said. "I'll talk to them." "The Territorial Education Board has regulations about informal schools. I wrote to the Blackstone Ridge Courthouse last week," she said. "Frontier territories allow informal schooling on private property with parental consent. There's no qualification requirement for a property-based instruction program as long as it's not receiving public funds." He blinked. "You already checked." "I wanted to know what I was actually proposing before I proposed it," she said. "I've been thinking about this since January." A long pause. "January," he said, "after the Greer boys visited for Christmas. Walt's grandsons. The older one, Thomas, he's 11. He read the label on the salt barrel wrong. He wasn't embarrassed about it. He just didn't know." She looked at the table. He didn't know, and nobody expected him to know. Ronan was quiet. She could see him thinking, not about the practical logistics, which he'd already moved through, but about something further back. "Margaret wanted a school," he said finally. It came out quietly, not as a comparison, but as a plain fact. "She talked about it our first year. She said the territory's children were falling through the gap between town and ranch." Delilah didn't say anything. "She would have—" He stopped. She would have thought this was right, he said. I'm not doing it for Margaret, Delilah said gently. I know, he said. I know you're not. He looked at the ledger, then back at her. I'm saying it because it's true, and because... He picked up his pen and turned it in his hand. Because I want you to know that this place has been waiting for someone to do something like this for a long time. She looked at him. This man who said things once, plainly, and did not repeat them. All right, she said. Then let's talk about the outbuilding. The first resistance came from a direction she should have predicted, but didn't quite. Hector Vega was a good ranch hand, reliable, skilled with cattle, loyal to the property in the unspoken way of a man who had decided to stay somewhere and meant it. She had gotten along with him easily since autumn, and she had assumed that ease would extend to this. She found him in the near pasture the following morning and explained what she was planning. The schoolroom in the east outbuilding, the morning sessions 3 days a week, Miguel and his younger sister Elena able to attend starting in May. Hector listened with his hat in his hands, the way he listened to things that made him uncomfortable. My children don't need school, he said when she was done. She looked at him. Miguel can't read. His father can't read English and his father works a good ranch, Hector said, and there was no defensiveness in it. He meant it as a factual rebuttal. Reading's not what a man needs on a cattle operation. It's what a man needs to read a contract, she said, or understand a supply order, or know when someone's pricing clause is taking money out of his wages. Hector was quiet. I'm not saying what Miguel should do with his life, she said. I'm saying he should be able to choose. He can't choose what he can't access. A long pause. Hector looked at his hat. Elena's 7, he said. She's a girl. Yes, Delilah said, and I'm a woman who managed a business's accounts and identified a fraudulent contract clause and ran this ranch's supply operation through a blizzard because someone let me learn things. She held his gaze. I'm not telling you to send them. I'm asking. She left him there and went back to the house and did not know what he'd decide, and she was not going to spend energy on what she couldn't control. 2 days later, Hector found her in the kitchen garden and said, without preamble, Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings, both of them. Elena needs to be done by noon. She's got her mother's work. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, she said. Done by noon. He nodded and walked away. She turned back to the garden and pulled a weed with slightly more force than necessary because the relief of it needed somewhere to go. The outbuilding conversion took 3 weeks and more of Ronan's patience with the supply budget than she'd initially estimated. She had underestimated the cost of benches, good ones, stable enough for children to sit on for 2 hours without wobbling, and the need for a proper board on the south wall, and the reality that the room's single window was not going to provide adequate light in the morning without cutting a second one in the east wall, which was a half-day carpentry job that Cody volunteered for without being asked. You didn't have to do that, she told Cody when he showed up with the tools. I know, he said. He measured the wall and marked the cut line with chalk. I didn't go to school past age 10, he said, without looking at her. My family was moving too much. He traced the chalk line with his finger. I've been teaching myself out of whatever I can find. It's slow. She looked at the back of his head. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, she said. You're welcome to the morning session. I won't say anything to anyone if you'd rather it stayed quiet. He turned around. He was 20, and in that moment he looked younger than that. I can come. You can come, she said. He turned back to the wall and started cutting, and she pretended not to notice that it took him a moment to start, because the moment needed its privacy. The school opened the second Monday of May with 7 children and one 20-year-old ranch hand. She had expected resistance from the neighboring families to be the ongoing battle, and there was some. Thomas Greer's father, Walt's son, was skeptical in the particular way of a man who had managed fine without formal education and didn't see why his children needed what he'd gotten along without. One of the Hawthorne boys never showed up at all, citing spring cattle work, which was true enough and also a convenient cover for a father who thought the whole arrangement was irregular. What she hadn't expected was Clara Voss. Clara arrived on a Wednesday morning in mid-May, in the clean buggy, with the composure that was her constant companion. Delilah was in the middle of a reading lesson. 7 children and Cody arranged on the benches, a primer laid open, Miguel sounding out a word with the concentration of a child who had decided this was something worth doing, when she heard the wagon outside. She went to the door and found Clara standing in the yard, looking at the outbuilding. "I heard," Clara said by way of greeting. "I assumed you would," Delilah said. "Can I see it?" Delilah stepped back from the door. Clara came in, and her eyes moved over the room the way they always moved over everything, taking inventory. But this time, the inventory was different. She looked at the benches, the board, the primers, the children bent over their work. She looked at Miguel, who was sounding through a sentence with his finger following each word. She looked at Cody, who had a reader open in his lap and was not pretending he didn't. She was quiet for a moment. "Edwin's foreman has 3 children," she said. "The youngest is 5. The older 2 are 8 and 10. They haven't been to school since we took over the Faro lease 3 years ago. It doubled the distance to town." "Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings," Delilah said. "Tell them to bring their own readers if they have them. If they don't, I have 3 spares." Clara looked at her. For the first time in their acquaintance, the composure shifted enough to show something underneath it, something that was not quite an apology, but was adjacent to one. "I underestimated you," Clara said. "Yes," Delilah said. "I'm saying so." "I know, thank you." Clara looked at the room once more, and then she said, "I know 4 families in the eastern part of the territory. The Brinton Ranch, the Sadler Place, 2 homestead families. They're 15 miles out. Their children have never attended school. Not once." Delilah looked at her. "If you're going to do this properly," Clara said, "you're going to need more than 1 room." Boss. She wasn't wrong, and Delilah knew it, and the knowledge sat with her through the rest of May and into June while the first session ran its course, and she watched Miguel read a full sentence aloud to his father one evening from the doorway of the bunkhouse, and watched Hector's face do something he would not have wanted anyone to see. The problem was resources. 1 room, 1 teacher, herself, 3 mornings a week was manageable. 2 rooms, a second teacher, reaching families 15 miles out, was a different scale entirely, and a different scale meant a different kind of planning. She brought it to Ruth Calhoun in June during their monthly Blackstone Ridge meeting. Ruth listened with the focused attention she brought to things that interested her, which were primarily things involving logistics and practical problems with actual solutions. "You need a second teacher," Ruth said. "I need someone with more formal qualification than I have," Delilah said, "for the program to grow into something legitimate, someone the Territorial Education Board would recognize." "There's a woman in Blackstone Ridge," Ruth said, "Nora Aldis. She taught in Illinois for 6 years before she came west with her husband. He died last year. She's been taking in sewing." Ruth looked at Delilah directly. "She's good. She doesn't have a position. Could you arrange an introduction?" "I can do better than an introduction," Ruth said. "My husband owns the Aldis house through the estate settlement. We've been meaning to address the situation for months. If you can offer her a wage and a purpose, I can free her from the rent obligation." Delilah looked at her. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about the children in this territory for longer than you've been in it," Ruth said, not unkindly. "I just didn't have the mechanism." She picked up her coffee cup. "You're the mechanism." Nora Aldis was 41 years old, thin, precise, and had the particular resilience of a woman who had rebuilt her life from a point of serious loss and had decided, on the other side of the rebuilding, that she was not going to spend whatever came next on things that didn't matter. She came out to Ashcroft Ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, and Delilah showed her the outbuilding schoolroom and explained the program and watched her look at everything with the critical eye of someone who had actually run a classroom. "The light's adequate," Nora said. "The benches are too high for the younger ones. You'll want a lower row." "I know," Delilah said. "It's on the list." "What books do you have?" Delilah showed her the inventory. Nora went through it with the focused efficiency of someone cataloging by subject rather than by title, reading primers, arithmetic basics, a basic geography, 2 history books. "No science," Nora said. "Not yet." "You'll want science," Nora said. "Frontier children are surrounded by it. Soil composition, weather patterns, animal biology. You teach them what they're already living in, and they learn faster." She straightened up from the books. "I'll need to write to my contact in Springfield for supplemental material. She sends overstock from the Chicago publishing houses." Delilah looked at her. You already have a contact. I've been a teacher for 20 years, Nora said, in the tone of someone stating a professional credential. I didn't stop being one because my husband died and I moved to a different territory. No, Delilah said. You didn't. Nora looked at her for a moment with an assessing directness that was different from Clara Voss's social inventory. It was the look of a professional evaluating whether a collaborator was serious. You don't have a formal qualification, Nora said. I know. But you built this, Nora said. From nothing. I noticed a problem, Delilah said, and I had a room. A problem, and a room is how most useful things get started, Nora said. She looked around the outbuilding once more. I'll take the position. I'll need to know the wage by the end of the week. You'll have it by tomorrow, Delilah said. Chub. Ronan heard the wage number that evening and was quiet for longer than usual. That's a significant commitment, he said. I know. Against the Eastern Section lease revenue we added this spring, she said, we can carry it for 1 year without affecting operations. If the program grows, and it will grow, there are territorial education grants for established frontier programs. Ruth's husband knows the territorial commissioner. That path is available. He looked at the figures she'd written out. You've already done the projection, he said. I've been doing the projection since March, she said. He was quiet for another moment, then, Douglas Farrell is going to say you're overstepping. Douglas Farrell has been trying to lease our Eastern Section since before I arrived, she said. His opinions about what I should and shouldn't do are consistent with his interests, not with reality. Something happened at the corner of Ronan's mouth. That same almost laugh from the very beginning, but easier now, more settled. Hire her, he said. Yes, the summer session opened in July with 14 children across 2 age groups, Nora running the older children's arithmetic and reading comprehension, while Delilah managed the younger group's foundational literacy. Cody came on Fridays still, now working through a proper reading program that Nora had put together for him with the matter-of-fact professionalism of someone who did not consider it unusual to educate a ranch hand alongside a room full of 8-year-olds. The Brinton family sent their 2 children the 3rd week of July, a girl of 9 and a boy of 12 who had never held a primer in their lives, and arrived with a kind of wary, defensive embarrassment that Delilah recognized immediately as the posture of someone who expects to be judged for what they don't know. She paired the 12-year-old with Miguel, who was now 6 months into the program and reading simple sentences with something approaching confidence. She did it quietly, as if it were simply the practical arrangement, and watched the defensive posture begin to loosen over the course of the first morning as the boy realized that Miguel, who was smaller and younger, was not going to look down at him for starting from the beginning. After the session, she found the Brinton boy sitting on the outbuilding step, looking out at the yard. You all right? She said. I'm 12, he said, and I just learned what a vowel is. That's true, she said, sitting down beside him. He stopped. Embarrassing? She said. He looked at the ground. The man who taught me to read contracts was 63 years old, she said. He'd been in business for 40 years, and he'd been misreading the quarterly tax forms for 20 of them. He sat across from me at a hardware store table, and I walked him through it. She paused. He wasn't embarrassed. He was just glad to know. The boy was quiet. You're 12, she said, which means you have approximately 70 years left if you're lucky, during which you will be able to read. She stood up. That seems like a reasonable return on one summer. He came back on Wednesday. Yes. By September, the program had 18 students and was running 4 mornings a week. Nora had sent for the Chicago materials, and 3 crates had arrived at the Blackstone Ridge Depot in August, including the science book she'd specified and a supplemental mathematics series that extended through basic algebra. The Territorial Education Board sent a notice in late September. Someone had registered the program in a formal capacity, which Delilah later learned had been Ruth's husband, quietly, through the commissioner connection, without telling her in advance. The notice required a formal inspection to qualify for territory recognition. She read it twice at the kitchen table and then set it down. Problem? Ronan said from across the table. The Education Board wants to inspect the program, she said, for official territory recognition. Is that bad? She thought about it. It means I have to explain to someone with a formal qualification Why a woman without one is running an educational program on a cattle ranch in the middle of nowhere. You've explained harder things to harder people, he said. I know, she said. She picked up the notice again. I just need to make sure everything is exactly right before they come. When have you ever had it any other way? He said, not as a question. She looked at him across the table. This man she had chosen in a cooperative hall in October, who had chosen her back, who had been counting on her ledger columns and her supply projections and her light in the window, and who was now, without ceremony or performance, simply counting on her. And she felt, as she sometimes did in these ordinary moments, the full weight of how far she had come from the woman standing near the back wall, expecting nothing. I'll need to write to Nora tonight, she said. We have 3 weeks. Then we have 3 weeks, he said, and turned back to his own work. Outside, the first cool breath of a new autumn moved through the territory, carrying the smell of dry grass and coming change, and the land that had once felt foreign to her feet now felt, simply, like the ground she stood on. Hers. Built from the things she'd noticed and the things she'd acted on and the long, steady accumulation of days in which she had simply refused to stop. 3 weeks, she thought, more than enough. The Territorial Education Board sent its inspector on a Tuesday morning in mid-October, exactly 2 years to the month after Delilah had stepped off a stagecoach in Blackstone Ridge, smelling of wet leather and other people's hope. His name was Arthur Graves, and he arrived in a rented buggy from town looking like a man who had formed opinions before leaving his office and was now conducting the formality of confirming them. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, with the pressed, particular quality of a bureaucrat who had spent his career in rooms where his authority was unquestioned, and he looked at Ashcroft Ranch, at the working yard, the barns, the cattle in the near pasture, the outbuilding with its new east window, with an expression that said he was already composing his report. Delilah met him in the yard. She had thought about how to present herself for this meeting, and she had decided to present herself exactly as she was. In her working clothes, with the supply journal under her arm, and the program documentation she and Nora had prepared in a folder she'd borrowed from the ranch's account files. She was not going to perform anything. She had stopped performing things. Mrs. Ashcroft, Graves said, stepping down from the buggy with the careful movement of a man whose lower back gave him trouble. Mr. Graves, she said, thank you for coming out. The drive is considerable, he said, which was not a complaint, but was not a complaint. I'll make it worth your time, she said. Come and see what we've built. She took him through the program with the same methodical clarity she brought to supply inventories and contract reviews. The outbuilding schoolroom, which Nora had organized into 2 clear sections, the younger group's literacy station with its low-road benches that Cody had rebuilt in August, and the older group's work tables with the Chicago mathematics series and Nora's science materials arranged by subject. The enrollment register she'd kept since May, noting each child's name, home property, starting level, and current progress. The attendance record, which showed a consistency that surprised even her when she looked at it assembled, 73% average attendance across 18 students over 4 months, which Nora had told her was better than the Blackstone Ridge Town School's reported rate. Graves went through the documentation with his glasses perched at the end of his nose, turning pages with the careful, unhurried pace of someone who was going to be thorough, whether or not the answer was already clear. Nora taught the morning session while Graves observed from a chair near the door, and Delilah stood against the wall and watched him watch Nora work. Whatever he'd expected from a cattle ranch outbuilding in the middle of frontier territory, it was not this. Nora moving through a long division lesson with the relaxed authority of a woman who had done this for 20 years. The older children bent over their slates with the concentrated effort of students who understood that the material mattered. The younger group at their station managing a reading exercise with a quiet, absorbed quality that came from 4 months of knowing what a classroom felt like. Miguel read a full paragraph aloud when Nora called on him. Delilah did not look at Graves' face when that happened, but she was aware of him going still. After the session, she walked him back to the main house for coffee, and he sat at the kitchen table with his documentation folder and his glasses and looked at her for a long moment before he spoke. The program is more rigorous than I anticipated, he said. I know what you anticipated, she said pleasantly. He looked at her over his glasses. Mrs. Ashcroft, you came here expecting to find a rancher's wife playing school with the neighbor's children, she said. You found a functioning educational program with qualified instruction, documented enrollment and progress, proper materials, and better attendance rates than your town school. I'm not saying that to be difficult. I'm saying it because you're going to write a report, and I want your report to be accurate. A pause. Graves looked at his coffee cup. The primary instructor is fully qualified, he said, meaning Nora. Yes. The facility is adequate. The materials are appropriate. He turned a page in the folder. The enrollment is entirely from Frontier properties without access to the Blackstone Ridge School. That's the point, she said. He looked at her again. The territory has 3 other locations with similar gaps, he said. Eastern settlements, homestead clusters. No access within reasonable distance. She waited. If this program received territory recognition, he said slowly, it would qualify for the Frontier Education Fund allocation. The Territorial Commissioner established it last year specifically for situations like this. He closed the folder. The allocation could support expansion. To the other locations, she said. Theoretically, she held his gaze. What would it take? He was quiet for a moment. A formal proposal to the Commissioner's office, documented replication model, how the program was established, what resources it required, what outcomes it produced, something another property could actually follow. He picked up his coffee. It would also need a name. A recognized territory program needs a formal designation. She had not thought about a name. She thought about it now, sitting in the kitchen where she had first sorted through the pile of overdue papers and drafted a letter about a fraudulent feed contract in the house that had been a failing, struggling thing when she arrived and was now something different. The Ashcroft Frontier Learning Program, she said. Graves wrote it down. The territory recognition came through in December, the 2nd December of her marriage, and it arrived the same week that Ronan told her, quietly, at the kitchen table, that she was going to be a mother. She had known for 3 weeks and had been waiting for the right moment, which she had then realized was not a thing she was going to manufacture, and so she simply told him one evening when the supper dishes were done and the ledger was open between them and the lamp was burning low. He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," she said. "I've been fine, a little tired." "You've been a little tired for 3 weeks," he said. "And I thought it was the inspection preparation." "Some of it was the inspection preparation," she said. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, not quite any of the expressions she had catalogued over the past year. It was undefended in a way his face rarely was. The careful, habitual control of a private man simply not there, replaced by something open and uncertain. And underneath both of those, something that was close to the specific relief of someone who had stopped believing a particular thing was possible for them. "Ronan," she said. "Margaret and I tried for 4 years," he said. His voice was level, but the levelness was work. "After she died, I stopped thinking about it." "I know," she said. He looked at the table, then at her. "You're not scared." She thought about it honestly. "I'm 33 years old and I've never done this before," she said. "Yes, I'm scared, but I've been scared before and done the thing anyway. That seems to be my pattern." Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile and not quite something else. Some combination of the two that she didn't have a word for but understood. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, the way he had in the kitchen during the blizzard, but without the tentative quality of that first time. He just held it, his rough, work-hardened hand over hers, steady. "We'll be all right," he said. "I know," she said. "I know we will." The formal proposal for territorial expansion went to the Commissioner's office in January, built from 3 months of documentation that Delilah had assembled with the same methodical attention she brought to everything. The replication model, the resource requirements, the outcome records, the enrollment data. Ruth's husband had a conversation with the Commissioner at the New Year's territorial meeting, and the conversation had apparently gone well enough that the proposal was moved to the front of the review calendar. Nora had written 4 pages of the educational methodology section, and they were the best 4 pages in the document, precise and professional, and carrying the weight of a woman who had spent 20 years in classrooms and knew exactly what she was talking about. The response came in February. Territory recognition confirmed, Frontier Education Fund allocation approved for the Ashcroft program, and conditional approval for 2 expansion sites pending proposal review. Delilah read the letter at the kitchen table twice, then set it down, then picked it up and read it again. Ronan came in from the yard and found her sitting there with the letter in her hand. "Well?" he said. She looked up. "We're official," she said. He sat down across from her. "And the expansion?" "2 sites pending. They want proposals for the Brinton Territory Cluster and the Eastern Homestead Settlements." She set the letter down flat. "That's 40 more children." "That's 40 more children," he agreed. "I'm going to need Nora to take the primary program," she said. "I can't run the ranch operations and manage a territory-wide expansion, and—" She looked at her hands, which were still resting on the letter. "I'm going to need help." It was not easy for her to say. She had been the person who managed things, who built systems and ran numbers and handled the parts that weren't being handled, for so long that asking for help carried the specific weight of something she'd had to learn from scratch. "I know someone," Ronan said. She looked at him. "Walt's daughter-in-law," he said. "Thomas's mother, Walt's son's wife. She was a teacher's assistant back in Ohio before they came west. She's been at the Greer homestead for 2 years with nothing to do but manage a very small house and feel underutilized." He paused. "Walt mentioned it once. I think he mentioned it because he was hoping I'd pass it along." She thought about Thomas Greer, the 11-year-old who had misread the salt barrel label at Christmas, who was now, 18 months later, reading at a level that Nora had described as genuinely advanced for his age. "Tell Walt," she said. "I already told Walt," Ronan said. "Last week, when you were finishing the proposal draft. I told him to have her come by." She looked at him steadily. He was looking back at her with the expression of a man who had learned over the course of a year and a half to anticipate the thing that was coming next and take whatever steps were available to him. "You've been paying attention," she said. "You made it look useful," he said. Bassett. Their daughter was born in June, on a morning when the territory was full of the particular green-gold light of early summer, and the cottonwoods along the creek were in their full leaf, and the cattle in the near pasture were standing in the long grass with the specific contentment of animals in good conditions. They named her Clara, not for Clara Voss, though that woman had earned a different kind of regard over the preceding 2 years, but for Delilah's mother, who had died when Delilah was 19, and who had been, in the way of mothers who leave too early, the primary teacher of the things that had mattered most. Walt held his hat in his hands when he heard the name and said nothing, which was his version of being moved. Patrick Drum said, in the kitchen doorway, that it was a good strong name, and then immediately began telling a story about a woman named Clara he'd worked for in Wyoming, who had run the toughest cattle operation in 3 counties, which no one had asked for but which everyone understood was his version of a gift. Cody stood in the yard and looked at the main house with an expression of complete inability to process the magnitude of the occasion, then recovered himself and went back to work. Ronan sat in the chair beside the bed and held his daughter with the careful, slightly terrified attention of a man holding something that matters more than he has words for. And Delilah watched him from the pillow and thought about the word good, the specific word he'd said on the porch in January of the previous year, when she'd told him she wasn't the kind of person who left. The relief underneath it. The man who had been alone for 8 years after losing the person he'd built his life around, sitting in that blizzard kitchen with his cold hands and his careful, undefended face, reaching across the space between them. She had never expected this. She had spent 8 months expecting nothing, because expecting nothing was the rational response to 8 platforms and 7 rejections and a lifetime of rooms where people looked past her. She looked at her husband holding their daughter in the early summer light, and she thought, this is what you get when you don't let the arithmetic be the last word. The Blackstone Ridge Frontier Cooperative held its annual meeting in August of that year, the same August that the Eastern Homestead expansion site opened with 11 children and a teacher trained by Nora on the Ashcroft model. Delilah attended with the baby in a carrier and Ronan beside her, and she sat in the same room. The cooperative hall, the long table, the mismatched chairs along the walls, where 3 years earlier she had stood near the back, near the end of the selection, the last woman not chosen. The meeting was about the territory's educational development. The Ashcroft program was on the agenda. Graves, who had apparently developed a more accurate set of opinions since his October inspection, presented the territory recognition and the expansion results with an efficiency that Delilah respected. Ruth Calhoun asked 3 precise questions about funding sustainability. Edwin Voss asked 1 question about the Eastern settlement expansion that was genuinely interested rather than skeptical. Douglas Farrell was in the room. He had not spoken to her directly since the Voss dinner, though she was aware, through Ruth's reliable intelligence, that his opinions had shifted their register over the past year, from active skepticism to a quieter, watchful quality that Ruth described as a man recalibrating. The Eastern section lease he'd been angling for had been rendered permanently unavailable when Ronan extended the spring cattle operation into it in March, which had been, as both of them understood without discussing it explicitly, the concrete version of Delilah's words that winter night on the porch. After the meeting, Farrell came over. He was not a small man, and he approached with the particular deliberateness of someone who had decided to do something difficult and was going to do it before he talked himself out of it. "Mrs. Ashcroft," he said. "Mr. Farrell," she said. He looked at the baby, then at her. "My foreman has 2 children of school age," he said. "His property's 8 miles from the Brinton cluster site." She waited. "I was wondering if the program could accommodate them," he said. It came out with the controlled difficulty of a man who was not accustomed to asking for things from people he'd underestimated. She looked at him. This man who had talked around her at a dinner party to make sure other people were listening, who had spent 2 years deciding what she could and couldn't manage. "Monday, Wednesday, Friday mornings," she said. "Have them at the Brinton site before 8. If they don't have readers, we have spares." He nodded. He started to move away and then stopped. "What you've built here," he said, and it was clearly hard for him to say it, "is not what I expected." "I know," she said. "It rarely is." He moved away through the room, and she felt Ronan's hand at her back. Brief, light, the simple contact of a man registering a moment, and she looked at the cooperative hall around her, the long table, the mismatched chairs, Harriet Dole talking with Ruth Calhoun near the window, the autumn light coming through the glass. She had stood in this room as the woman nobody chose. She stood in it now as something she didn't have a clean title for. Rancher's wife, program founder, territory education figure, whatever Clara Graves would call her in whatever report he sent to the commissioner's office. Those were labels applied from outside. They described what was visible. What she actually knew, standing there with her daughter against her chest and her husband's hand at her back, was something simpler and harder to articulate and more true than any label. She knew that the version of herself who had stood near the back wall 3 years ago, quiet with the specific exhaustion of a woman who had stopped arguing with arithmetic, that woman had not been broken. She had just been waiting in the wrong rooms for the wrong verdict. The verdict had never been anyone else's to give. What? She thought about this later on the ride home, with Clara asleep in the carrier and Ronan driving the way he always drove, with the loose-handed competence of a man who had made this road so many times it was part of him. The October light was on the land, that particular gold that only existed for a few weeks in autumn, when the grass had gone dry and the low sun hit it at an angle that made the whole territory look like something lit from inside. She had spent a long time believing that her value was a question other people answered, that the sum of herself was visible in what people chose or didn't choose when they looked at her. 8 platforms. 7 rejections. The accumulated weight of rooms full of men who looked past her toward something they found more appealing. She understood now that the thing she'd been waiting for those men to give her was something she had been carrying the whole time. They hadn't been withholding it. They'd simply never had it to offer. Worth didn't work that way. It wasn't transferred. It wasn't bestowed. It was built. In the same way that a school was built, or a supply system was built, or a winter was survived. By showing up, doing the work, refusing to leave, and keeping the lamp burning in the window. "You're quiet," Ronan said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the land around her land, her territory now. The 12,000 working acres and the lease sections and the creek bend and the cottonwoods and the east outbuilding with its 2 windows and its low road benches and its crates of Chicago science books. The children who had never held a primer and now could read their father's contracts. Cody Birch, who was 22 and had just begun corresponding with a woman in Blackstone Ridge and had written the first letter himself. Miguel Vega, who had read a paragraph aloud to his father and changed something between them that had been closed before. "About what you get," she said, "when you keep going past the point where stopping feels reasonable." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "What do you get?" he said. She looked down at her daughter, asleep against her chest, with the absolute trust of a small person who had never been given any reason to expect anything other than being held. "This," she said. He reached across and took her hand on the seat between them, and they rode the rest of the way home in the October gold without speaking, the land running out in every direction to the Blue Ridge Mountains and the enormous sky, and the ranch appearing ahead of them over the final rise, lit by the last of the afternoon light. The barns, the pens, the bunkhouse with its smoke beginning, the main house with the covered porch where they sat in the evenings and had sat through a winter and a blizzard, and the long, quiet accumulation of a life neither of them had planned, but both of them had chosen, every ordinary day, again and again, in the small and unremarkable ways that real things got built. The Ashcroft Frontier Learning Program would go on to establish 4 sites across the territory before Delilah turned 40. It would train 11 teachers, most of them women without formal certification, who were qualified in every way that actually mattered. By attention, by stubbornness, by the refusal to believe that children growing up without access to education was simply the natural condition of the frontier and not a problem someone could address. Nora Aldis would run the primary program for 12 years, until her eyesight made the work difficult, at which point she would transition to teacher training with the focused professionalism of someone who had no intention of stopping entirely. She and Delilah would argue regularly about methodology and curriculum and the proper placement of bookshelves, and would remain, across all of it, the kind of friends formed in the middle of hard, purposeful work. Ruth Calhoun would become the program's most effective advocate at the territorial level, translating its results into the specific language of economic and community benefit that moved commissioners and fund administrators. She would never call it charity. She called it infrastructure, which was accurate, and which was the word that made the right people pay attention. Thomas Greer would leave the territory at 20 to study in Denver, the first person from any of the Ashcroft program's enrolled families to pursue formal higher education. He would come back 6 years later as a surveyor, and he would sit at the Ashcroft kitchen table and show Delilah a map he'd drawn of the territorial water rights system, precise, detailed, the product of everything that education had made possible. And she would look at it and remember a boy who had misread a salt barrel label at Christmas, and decide, in the way that boys decided things when someone made the decision matter, to learn. Ronan would run the ranch with the steadiness and intelligence that had always been there, and he would add to it, over time, the habit Delilah had given him, of noticing what was actually happening rather than assuming, of reading the fine print, of looking up at the sky before deciding the day's plan was fixed. He would not become a different man. He would become a more complete version of the man he already was. That was all that love required of anyone. Their daughter Clara would grow up in a house where the kitchen table was also a planning desk, where supply journals sat beside reading primers, where the line between running a home and changing a territory was not a line at all, but simply the same work viewed from different distances. She would grow up understanding, without anyone explaining it to her, that the most durable things were built by people who showed up when it was hard and kept going, when stopping seemed reasonable, and never confused other people's failure to recognize their worth with an actual absence of it. She would be a difficult child in the best possible sense, curious, argumentative, stubborn in ways that her father recognized with a familiar, resigned affection, and that her mother recognized with something closer to pride. And Delilah, in the years that followed, when someone asked her, she, as people occasionally did, with the particular uncertainty of people trying to understand a life that didn't fit a familiar shape, when someone asked her what had changed, what had been the turning point, what had made the difference, she never said it was Ronan, though Ronan had mattered. She never said it was the ranch or the program or the territory recognition. She said, "I stopped waiting for someone to tell me what I was worth." She said it plainly, the way she said everything, without sentiment, without the decorative edges of a lesson being delivered. Just the fact of it, which was the most useful thing she had learned across 33 years of standing in rooms where people formed opinions about her and moving forward anyway, through every judgment and every closed door and every morning on the other side of the night, she'd spent with her hand on the bolt of a door, waiting for the sound of her husband's footsteps in the yard. You are not the sum of the rooms that didn't choose you. You are not the verdict of the people who looked past you. You are what you build when you take the thing you've been carrying all along, the competence, the attention, the refusal to fold, and you stop waiting for permission to use it. The frontier did not remember Delilah Mercer as the bride nobody wanted. The frontier remembered her as the woman who built something where there was nothing, who kept the lamp burning when the storm came, who looked at a room full of children who had never held a book and decided, quietly and without anyone's authorization, that this was going to change. The frontier remembered her as a woman who stayed, and in the end, that was the whole of it. Not the titles or the recognition or the letters from the commissioner's office, or the 4 program sites, or the 11 teachers trained, or the hundreds of children who learned to read in rooms she had built from noticed problems and available space. Just the staying, just the work, just the light in the window when the darkness came in hard, and the wind said, "Give up," and the arithmetic said, "Impossible," and she said, in the plain and unperformative way of someone who had learned that this was simply what she did, "Not yet. Not today. I'm still here.